One thing you may or may not have picked up throughout the show is that I like movies. Growing up, I remember a lot of great moments in my life centered around film and sometimes TV. Whether it was watching Mystery Science Theater 3000 with my dad, or going out to the local AMC with my friends on a Friday night, I just really loved the worlds that it brought you to. Naturally, in terms of a show, that means that throughout the years, I've seen my fair share of movies that try their hand at showing scenes that involve hacking or cyber in some cool and unique ways. And don't get me wrong, I love this field, but the edgy, high speed, and all the flashy things that come with Hollywood in terms of showcasing hacking don't tend to overlap as much as the screen would have you think. But where do they get it right? Or at least as close to right as we can ask them to. This week, in a special little holiday episode of a show, I thought I'd take a break from the normal cycle of advanced threats and look into some of my favorite hacking scenes that are actually close to getting it right. They'll be from a couple of different pieces of media and talk about what worked, what didn't, and maybe explain something that you might not have known about Hollywood as we go through this. I'm John Cordes, and this week, I'm inviting you to come back to Hollywood with me. Although this time we'll be leaving Sony and the Lazarus Group out of it, I want to talk about hacking and cyber in movies and what the hell is going on when they're putting this stuff together. So a couple things off the bat here. You might be thinking it's Friday, normally this happens every other Wednesday. Well, I originally had a whole episode around good and terrible hacking in movies and TV written and planned, but I realized it didn't work as well as I wanted to. What I found after I recorded it, and what I'm sure some of you all are pretty familiar with as well, is that a lot, and I mean a lot, of bad hacking in media comes from insane visuals. Whether it's a 3D render of a Unix file structure in Jurassic Park, the hacking battles in Hackers, or a car chasing down a plane to plug into an Ethernet slot. A lot of this bad stuff just doesn't really work in audio format. I could describe the good stuff and walk you through it, but as I mentioned in the last show, I'm going to try my hand at a video format soon, so I'm going to use this as my way to do that. Today, we're going to talk about the ones that get it right, and eventually, I'll put out a video that covers the bad ones, and some of the more outlandish scenarios. That way you'll have a visual reference of what I'm actually talking about. So let's see about the ones that at least maybe come close and have one foot in the door of reality. I'm going to start with what I think a lot of people consider to be the golden standard, and that's Mr. Robot. Now, if you haven't heard of Mr. Robot, first off, what are you doing? Go watch it. It's truly one of my favorite shows. The writing, Mac Quayle's score for it, the filmography, it's a great watch from start to finish, but it can be a little exhausting, so take your time for it. But really, here's the mile-high view if you don't plan on it. The show follows Elliot Alderson. Elliot is a cybersecurity engineer by day and a vigilante hacker kind by night. Pretty quickly, we learn that he struggles with mental health issues and some kind of societal disillusionment. Elliot gets a visit by a mysterious anarchist known as Mr. Robot, and he gets invited to join an underground hacker group called F Society. Their goal is to take down E Corp, a powerful multinational company, and then erase all consumer debt, which they believe will free society from financial tyranny. Now, if this all sounds a little bit familiar, it's because it is based on some of the more real groups that tended to come around in this time period, groups like LulzSec or Anonymous, and in this case, F Society is a play on the phrase, fuck society. What sets Mr. Robot apart is that it has a level of dedication to authenticity and technical accuracy in its portrayal of hacking that I don't think we really get in other places. If you listen to interviews in the writing room, they consult with cybersecurity experts to depict realistic hacking techniques and tools. They'll use things like Kali Linux, social engineering, and honestly, a lot of different forms of pre, during, and post exploitation. But just how realistic is it? Well, let's look at episode 1. That way we're not spoiling anything really, they're still establishing characters. The lead up to the scene that I'm about to put you into is pretty simple. What did Elliot do last night? Well, in this case, he went to one of his favorite places to eat and go online, and ended up putting out justice in the form of, well, let's just listen in. He's leaving a restaurant when he stops and sits down with the owner in what was for him a planned confrontation, but the owner has no idea what's happening. I'll let you listen in.
You're Ron. But your real name's Rohit Mehta. You changed it to Ron when you bought your first Ron's Coffee Shop 6 years ago. Now you got 17 of them, with 8 more coming next quarter.
May I help you with something?
I like coming here because your Wi-Fi was fast. I mean, you're one of the few spots that has a fiber connection with gigabit speed. It's good. It's so good, it scratched that part of my mind. Part that doesn't allow good to exist without condition. So I started intercepting all the traffic on your network. That's when I noticed something strange. That's when I decided to hack you. I know you run a website called Plato's Boys.
Pardon me?
You're using Tor networking to keep the servers anonymous. You made it really hard for anyone to see it, but I saw it. The onion routing protocol, it's not as anonymous as you think it is. Whoever's in control of the exit nodes is also in control of the traffic, which makes me the one in control.
I must ask you to kindly leave.
I own everything. All your emails, all your files, all your pics.
Get out of here right now, or I'll call the
Police? You want them to find out about the 100 terabytes of child pornography you served to your 400,000 users? Personally, man, I was hoping it was just gonna be some BDSM stuff. You realize how much simpler that would have been?
So let's take a couple pieces out of here and talk about the initial interception that Elliot performed, and then move on to the Darknet stuff. When Mr. Robot was filmed and premiered, it was in the mid-2010s. That means a few things. A lot of encryption and traffic going over secure ports might not have been as commonplace as it is today. For example, it would have only been a few years after HTTPS made its way to Facebook that this occurred. So in terms of websites, some smaller sites might not have moved over to the more secure protocols. And in terms of establishments, they might not have migrated over to a more secure network, and the open network that they broadcast could have left things insecure for anyone joining in on it. To someone like Elliot, that means a couple things. Once he's on the network, he might need only go as far as using Wireshark, a packet sniffing tool, to observe the traffic that he's seeing on the network. There are some features that he might be able to use in Wireshark, like its ability to identify protocols, that would have hinted at traffic being sent over Tor nodes. Additionally, if Elliot took all the source and destination addresses that Wireshark gave him being shuttled across the network, it's possible that he could have compared that to a list of known Tor nodes, since he seems to be relatively active. In terms of the interception of network traffic, the second option he really could have gone with is that maybe Elliot places himself directly in the middle of the traffic. Elliot could have performed what's called a man-in-the-middle attack, where he sets up a fake router to look like a real one. And then that fake router is connected to the internet as well, maybe even through the legitimate router. What he can then do is use a free and open source tool like BetterCap or EtherCap to manipulate and pass along any traffic that comes through his fake router. BetterCap can scan for devices, discover services, and even find open ports within a network as well. In this case, one of its standout features is being able to perform attacks where it intercepts and manipulates communication between a user and a server without them knowing. It would work like this. Say you're at a restaurant and you want to connect to Ron's_Wi-Fi. It's open and it has a strong signal, so you connect. You get internet access and you are happy. You can finally browse while you eat. But what you really connected to here was Elliot, who then hands your stuff off to Ron's Wi-Fi for real, and it keeps moving along to your intended destination. When you browse to a website, you'll say something like, go to gmail.com, and your device will ask your router, or naming server, where gmail.com is, and point it at that IP address. If Elliot controls the equipment that does the pointing, he can say, go to my fake gmail.com, instead of real gmail.com. In an attack, an attacker might make a website that looks exactly like Gmail, take your credentials when you log in, send it along to a real Gmail, and return the client to you like nothing ever happened, but in reality, because he was in the middle there, he gets to make out with your username and password by just intercepting it. So by placing himself in the middle of a Wi-Fi, it's possible that Elliot could have gotten enough information from Ron himself to gain insight into a username and password, or to fool traffic to go through him for logging and abuse. The last point I'll make here is that he could also very well have just brute forced the logon credentials to Ron's router. A router's IP address is not secret, and the login portals often are pretty easy to find, so that you can sign in and do any of the admin work that you might need to do. There are quite literally hundreds of tools that you could use to brute force the username and password to the router with a list and just automate that, wait till something pops positive, and then now you have the credentials. And remember, how often am I complaining about default credentials and routers on this show? I'm sure Elliot could use Metasploit, he could use Hydra, he could use a myriad of command line tools to take common word lists, find a username and password, and suddenly he's an admin on the router, acting like it's his own property. Now let's go back to Tor. So you'll remember that we talked about the Onion router, Tor, back in episode 25, What is a Darknet? If you didn't listen to that, Tor is basically a routing protocol that's commonly used to access the dark net. It works like this. Using an entry point, such as the Tor browser, you get access to the dark web. The traffic that's passed through here maintains its privacy and security by bouncing itself through what are called volunteer nodes. Then, after the traffic hits the exit node, after several volunteer nodes, it will access the site you're looking for. It's really just passing your traffic around to the point where it becomes insanely difficult to trace back to the originating source. We know here that Elliot says he's in control of the exit node, so he knows theoretically where traffic's going in, maybe not in the middle, but also what's coming out. And what this means in the scope of the scene is that he's able to see the final destination of the addresses that are going. He can research it, he can observe the traffic that's going there, and ultimately get enough proof of what this guy is doing so that the police can come in and arrest him at the end of the scene. It's one of the first iterations of a vigilante hack that we really see from Elliot, and it's a great introduction to the character. Honestly, in this case, it's a hack that's not even very uncommon or super out of the realm for an at-home hacker to perform. Now let me say that I'm by no means suggesting that you go out and do this, but to do something like this, there's just so many ways to build your own way into it or even buy your way in. BetterCap and EtherCap can be loaded onto a Raspberry Pi device, and with the right Wi-Fi adapter, you can receive and broadcast networks. All in all, even buying new, I would wager that you could pull this off for $150. It's one of the reasons why people are so cautious about connecting to open Wi-Fi networks. Hypothetically, I could post up at something like a Panera Bread, host a fake access portal, and make it seem legit. Then do some malicious redirecting, and the only thing you might notice on your side is some potential latency issues. And if I wanted to spend even more money, I could go to something like Hack5 and get a Wi-Fi Pineapple, which does the bulk of the work for me and has a very easy to use user interface. That one might be a little more or less discreet depending on how you use it, because it actually does look like a router, but you can place it, hide it, bring it with you. There's an insane amount of options here. I want to move on though and talk about another example from another classic movie. And you know what? The clip here is only 25 seconds long, so I want to see if you can tell based on the audio what movie this is from.
Still no sight of them. I don't know what they're doing, but they only got 2 minutes left.
Alright, if you guessed The Matrix Reloaded, congratulations and wow. The scene in question here is when Trinity is hacking into a power grid to take parts of a city offline in The Matrix. For just a few seconds, you're able to get a glimpse at her terminal and see what kind of commands she's running and tools that she's using. Let's see if they make any sense. And I'll have screenshots on the website as well as links to the video for this, so you can go watch it there at whattheshellpod.com to take a closer look, or just wait for it to come to my Instagram, because I'll post it there too. That one is at @shell_pod. The first glimpse we see of the command line shows that port TCP22 is in a state of open, and it's labeled as SSH. It also says, quote, no exact OS matches for host, Nmap run completed, and one IP address found. This shows us that Trinity came in and ran a scan with a tool called Nmap. Nmap is a frequently used tool by hackers and professionals as well. At its core, it's a network mapper that will send packets across a network to wherever you want it to go and see what comes back to you in a way that allows you to get an idea of what's on the segment that you're scanning. I won't go into the finer details, but it will hit designated ports, return a status, and if that status is something of value, it can give you information on the port itself and what it's hosting. So here we saw that port 22 was accessible, which it then labeled as open, and then was able to tell you based on that value that it returned that it was running a remote access protocol called SSH. And that's exactly what the results would have looked like for a server that was running with an open SSH port. This means that Trinity could then theoretically use that port to SSH into the system, but she would need some level of credentials or access to an exploit that would get her in. And so with that, let's look at the next line, because that also gives us a little bit of information. According to the next line of dialogue on the terminal, she launches the command ssh nuke 10.2.2.2-root-pw equals z10-no101. Alright, let's break that down a little bit. We see that the terminal returns first that it's connecting over SSH, it's going to exploit SSH v1, and that it's successful. Then it reports that it's resetting the root password to that z10-no101 password that it listed. Finally, it gives a confirmation. From there, Trinity seems to use a standard SSH command to access the system with the password that she just put into the prompt. But is this a real exploit? Let's take a look at what SSH nuke actually is. Unfortunately, SSH nuke itself isn't an actual exploit kit, but it does attempt to use a very real buffer overflow vulnerability to exploit SSH v1 CRC32. So it's possible that Trinity just has some flair and wanted to rename it into something fun. The bug in SSH v1 CRC32 was discovered in 2001 by Michael Zalewski. Since this movie came out in 2003, that bug would have been just over 2 years old at the time of release, probably just over a year old, maybe less at the time of writing. The SSH CRC32 bug is a very real buffer overflow in a chunk of code that's designed to guard against cryptographic attacks on SSH v1. If it is properly exploited, it grants full remote access to the vulnerable machine. Or at least it could. We can look at ExploitDB, which is a common database of useful exploits, and find some information about what available exploit code is out there to see what might work with this, and if it's an actual thing. The first few lines that I found on one of the exploits give some descriptive comments and allow for some more information on our end, so let's talk about that. It says, quote, an integer overflow bug in the CRC32 compensation attack detection code may allow remote attackers to write values to arbitrary locations in memory. This would occur in situations where large SSH packets are received by either a client or a server. Alright, so a very dumbed down way to describe this is that if you give too many packets to the system on SSH, it's possible that you can go out of the boundaries of where the application runs and into system memory. If you control the memory of a system, you could potentially point it somewhere else and get it to execute something else on the box. From there, it's just a matter of controlling where you point it and what you want it to do. So what it's safe to maybe assume here is that what Trinity did was combine some of her own exploit code to force that buffer overflow to execute a command that would reset the root password in the context of a root user. Now I realize that not everyone might know this, so I want to step back. Root is the Linux and Unix version of administrator. From there, she can use that new password that she had set for this exploit to legitimately gain access to the system and start turning stuff off in the power grid. Honestly, it's another great example, even if it's only on screen for a combined 10 seconds or so, because for such little screen time, it's a lovely detail that has honestly aged super well. And for the last one I want to talk about, I want to move over to the 1983 classic, War Games. A film that, while filmed with some unrealistic hacking, shines when it comes to reconnaissance. If you're not familiar, War Games follows Matthew Broderick as David Lightman, who inadvertently hacks into a US military supercomputer. And again, the movie's depiction of hacking will sometimes venture into the realm of sci-fi, but the reconnaissance techniques that are portrayed here offer surprisingly accurate looks at early hacker methodology. And honestly, I think we're all going to give it a pass, if only for the iconic "would you like to play a game" line. And I've been talking it up enough. I've said that David's initial research and information gathering is the most realistic part of this, and I think most movies often gloss over those finer details. Hollywood tends to assume that you can just pop right into a system with a click of a button. David doesn't just stumble upon a military computer by accident. Instead, he engages on some things like social engineering, gathering information about the systems that he wants to access. He uses dial-up modems to scan for open networks. This method of war dialing, or dialing random numbers to find computer systems, was a genuine technique used by hackers in the 80s. I'm going to cut some audio in, so let's listen as David uses this method to find a bank, an airline, and, eventually, the supercomputer itself.
Oh, hey, you got a bank.
Gotta make a note of that one. Might come in handy someday. Where should we go?
Anywhere?
Anywhere.
New York?
New York? Okay.
No, Paris. Paris. Paris.
Will you be traveling alone?
Yeah. No, you wanna go with me?
All right. Smoking or non-smoking?
Non-smoking.
Non-smoking. All right, Miss Mack. You're confirmed on Pan Am's Flight 114, leaving Chicago's O'Hare Airport at 8:15 a.m. on 18 August. Do we need a rental car? No.
We really have tickets to Paris?
No, you have a reservation, though.
All he's doing here is just seeing what publicly available infrastructure is letting him in and getting him access. And I like in particular this scene because even with the trip to Paris, what he's seemingly doing is just adding a reservation to a database. And that's not really an unrealistic thing. Databases can be very insecure. But it seems like because there's no actual transaction occurring, it's nothing more than a reservation and not a confirmed ticket. Let's continue listening.
Doesn't identify itself. Huh. Try anything.
Connection terminated. How rude.
I'll ask you for help.
Can you do that?
Yeah, on some systems. See, the more complicated they are, the more they have to help you out.
Now what?
Help games.
Games refers to models, simulations, and games which have tactical
That must
and
be them.
strategic applications. What does that mean?
I don't know, but that's gotta be them. Turn on the printer, will you? I want to get a print out of this. List games.
And with that, the list of games pops up, showing things like Falcon's Maze, chess, rummy, hearts, checkers, poker, and just some casual global thermonuclear war. Even his process there is fairly reasonable. The only thing I'd criticize here is running help commands from a logon prompt. You can see that it's clearly asking for a username, and he's running commands like he's already in as an unprivileged user. Taking that aside, it's really fairly common for a hacker to see a new application and ask for help outputs to see what it can do. Nowadays, though, we might use Google instead of actually running it on the box. We might look for API documentation. We might look for configuration setup documentation, anything that we can use without actually disrupting the system or looking suspicious. You'll find a lot of examples like this in capture the flag exercises as well. Things like Hack the Box will often have applications that you're not expected to have familiarity with, but should be able to learn on the fly to understand as a part of the exercise. So running commands like help will really let you figure out what you have the ability to do, and in this case, what you can maybe enumerate. If you're trying to hack in and you heard that list of games, what would have popped out to you, besides the global thermonuclear war, right? Let's look at some of those other options again. Chess, rummy, hearts, checkers, Falcon's Maze, poker. For David, and I think for many hackers, it might have been Falcon's Maze, because that's not a real game. He could make the assumption that Falcon was maybe a person that created this game and added it to the system. And if it's a proprietary game, maybe Falcon is a username. And if it's a username, maybe, because we're in the early 80s, it's also a password. And we would eventually find out that this was someone's pseudonym. What we can see here is that David's careful planning and the data collection that he did mirror real-life reconnaissance efforts. They showcase the importance of patience, strategy, and understanding the target before any attempted actual hack occurs. While the movie does take many liberties with the actual hacking process, the groundwork that he lays is both credible and, I think, crucial to the plot. Let's think about what he might actually have done, though. In real life during the early 80s, David probably would have started by using a phone book or public directory to find potential targets. He'd manually dial the numbers to locate modems and computers that are connected to phone lines. Something that is no longer really done nowadays, but was very common. You can see this in the movie too, when he's placing his phone on the modem to actually connect to computers. This process, as I mentioned earlier, is known as war dialing. It was a common method to discover accessible systems back in the day. Once he identified a potential entry point, David would likely rely on default passwords or maybe even some known exploits. There wouldn't have been as heavy of a library at the time, but given the limited security awareness of the general public, it was probably super easy to find misconfigurations like that. And that's a kind of meticulous and manual approach that a lot of pen testers, a lot of red teamers, a lot of APTs have the patience and the keen eye to actually abuse in the real world. It's slow, it's strategic, and it's the nature of how early hacking efforts would eventually evolve into modern tools and techniques. It also kind of harkens back to episode 2 and 3 of the show, with Kevin Mitnick. War dialing and that kind of reconnaissance were exactly the kinds of enumeration you would expect someone like him to go for. While the rest of the movie, again, might be a little bit extreme, that bit of grounded recon really made me smile when I went back and watched it again as an adult. Alright, we talked about some of my top hacking scenes in movies here. I'm only going to cover 3 of them for today because I want to be able to come back to this. If you have any ideas or any suggestions for scenes that you think are good for hacking that I can do on the audio version of a show, feel free to reach out to me. You can do it in the Discord, you can do it on Instagram, you can email me at shellpod@protonmail.com. Mr. Robot, I could honestly probably do an entire side series breaking that down for a long time, given how much they actually do in that show that's close to being realistic. The Matrix, an iconic film series with its roots in hacking and cyberculture, how could I just ignore that? And then War Games. It's the epitome of a hacker stumbling upon something that he doesn't quite get and realizing that it's way more than he bargained for, and then things just keep escalating. I'm going to continue the series with the bad hacking in January, but probably that's only going to be on my YouTube channel. Don't feel pressured to subscribe there. Really, the only thing it's for right now is uploading the podcast to YouTube Podcasts, and it does house some of my old Hack the Box walkthroughs, but don't even worry about those. I'll plug that channel when the time comes and when the episode comes out. I've got one more bit of bonus content coming on New Year's Eve. I talked about it last time, but if you missed it, this year, at the suggestion of one of my friends, I kept a personal bingo card of goals, and I kept track of all the new media that I watched, I read, or I listened to. I thought it would be a fun little offshoot to take that and do a small dive into the kind of things that I got up to this year and maybe spread some recommendations your way, or steer you away from some really bad movies. Just promise you won't judge me for what I watch because some of it is kind of stupid. In terms of a show, we're on Blue Sky now, I said it last time, but Discord is still the primary method I use for communicating with a show, but I saw an avenue for expanding in Blue Sky, so you can find me there at shellpod, one word because I couldn't use the underscore. If you want to join the Discord, I've got an invite link in the episode description, so just click that and you should automatically be invited to join. I'd love to have you over there and talk. Maybe you can bring some of your favorite hacking and media over to the episode discussion after this one. And one little favor or call to action if you don't mind, if you can, share your favorite episode on social and tag me. I'd love to hear what worked for you from a show, even what didn't. And if you don't mind a positive review or a 5-star rating, that would help too. I'm still getting back into the algorithm, and That kind of thing really does work. Before we go, I also kind of have one weird question. Last week, I had a very, very bizarre day where we had 5 times the normal number of downloads. So if you found the show last week, I want to say that's January 12th at this point. Where did you hear about it from? Because I'm trying to figure out why all of a sudden one of my days that is normally an off day shot to 5 times the normal number of downloads that I would get on an episode release day. It was really perplexing to me, but honestly, I don't mind. It's a good problem to have. All right, I think that's enough pandering to the audience again. I'll see you all at the end of the year for a bonus episode. If you celebrate, I hope you have a happy holiday.